Good afternoon, everyone. It's straight up 12 o'clock, so let's get going. I am Suzanne Chaffee, Director of the UCSD Retirement Resource Center, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Henry Powell, who will present this wonderful presentation on music and film. Dr. Powell received his doctorate of medicine from the University College Dublin, Ireland in 1970. Professor Powell has clearly excelled in all academic missions. He's a distinguished world authority in experimental neuropathology with emphasis on the peripheral neuropathies. However, Dr. Powell is here in his other capacity as Renaissance thinker and expert about many fields outside of medicine. Professor Powell is the recipient of numerous awards, including the prestigious Dixon Award in recognition of his sterling record of service to the UCSD community and its retirees. Professor Powell has presented several Irish films for the RA in the framework of our International Film Series, which is currently on pause due to the pandemic. And for 2 years, he presented to a devoted audience his series, Face the Music. From this previous series came the request for his lecture today, Music and Film. I introduce you now to Henry Powell.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you very much for inviting me. And it's a real pleasure to talk about music. And I think we planned a series of presentations with the title Face the Music. And along the way, in talking about other musical topics, it became clear to me that there was one area of particular interest that I hadn't addressed, and that is, of course, film music. And I think it was actually Suzanne who said, after one of the remarkable film series that we used to have on Saturday afternoons, she said maybe a talk about film music would be very good. So this got me very, very interested, and I started to collect books about music and film. And I think that the music that goes with film is so critical that you really could not have film without music. And so that's basically going to be what I'm plan to explain with examples. And I'd like to talk about the history of film and how music became interwoven into film. And so maybe I think either Suzanne or Vanya are controlling the slides, or if I hit the advance button, will the first slide come up?
Just say next slide each time you want to move it.
There it is, next slide. Okay, so what is film music? Film music is music that's been arranged, compiled, or improvised to accompany motion pictures. That's the definition that you will find in the New Grove Dictionary of Music, which, by the way, has a superb multi-page entry on film music, which is very interesting to read. Now, the relationship of music and film goes back to one of the very first films, perhaps the first film ever presented in a commercial venue. And film was the discovery of two Frenchmen, two brothers called Lumière. And so the Lumières were, as often happens in the story of technology and invention, they were working on something that other people were working on too, but they appeared to have been the first filmmakers who successfully mounted a film event, and it was on the 28th of December, 1895. So on that day, they invited a group of people to pay for seats, and they proceeded to show a film that they'd created. At that time, projectors were in their infancy, and you hand cranked the projector in order to project the images. And so one of the things that happened when the Lumiere brothers started to show the film was that some people in the audience became quite nervous. And of course, why wouldn't they be nervous? They were seeing human images flitting across the screen. They were seeing humans that weren't alive. They were projections in the film. So in other words, they were having a kind of ghostly experience. And very quickly, the Lumiere brothers realized that you had to do something to keep the audience from getting unsettled. And so that's when they introduced music into film, right there at the moment. So they had, in their very first performance, there was a piano that was used, and then across the street, they found an instrument called the harmonium. Some people here in the audience may remember the harmonium. It's a reed instrument played with a keyboard and bellows. Back in the day when I was struggling to play music myself, I used to play on a harmonium as well as on a piano. So anyway, very quickly, it was realized that if you're going to show a movie, you needed to have music. So this was back in 1895, and the brothers Lumiere started out by hiring musicians. And they also found that if you wanted to have a successful afternoon of film, that sometimes you had to have stage actors. And at a certain point then, they would stop the stage acting and they'd show the film. And so people were willing to watch very, very nondescript stuff. Film was such a novelty that just watching people walking or smiling at the camera or anything like that, this was very intriguing to audiences, but it was also very clear that audiences needed to have music. Now, another point that I'm going to develop during this talk is to have a successful movie experience. You need to suspend disbelief. You need to be able to let your cares go out the window, so to speak, and just experience the movie as a physical and mental pleasure, and to fall under the spell of the movie. Now, in this regard, I'm going to say something later about the relationship of film and comic opera, because there's a very, very interesting relationship there, particularly about the notion of suspending disbelief. But let me have the next slide, if you please. Okay, so in 1927, soundtracks that could be incorporated into the film were available now for the studios and the producers to work with. But up until the time that soundtrack was developed, which was in the mid-20s, culminating in 1927, a whole culture of filmmaking had developed, in which sometimes the music was played by real orchestras, and sometimes the music was played by pianists or organists. Sometimes there was a chorus, and this is very, very important when I mention the word chorus, because of course that takes us back to Greek theater in which you had a protagonist on the stage, but you also had a chorus which could sing or dance or comment on what was happening and sometimes pass judgment. So the concept of chorus or involvement by another peripheral group was very, very important. Now, whatever you did in order to successfully entertain the public, one thing you had to do was provide music. And so one of the successes of theater back in the 20s and 30s was because people kept coming, the halls in which movies were projected were more elegant and more luxurious, and some of them had a pipe organ, and also a whole new type of organ was built just for the movies. And these were organs built by companies like Kimball and Wurlitzer. And so you're looking here at an image of a Wurlitzer organ. These organs had such extraordinary capacity to produce sound and an enormous variety of sound. They were known as the mighty Wurlitzers. And if you've been to a baseball game where they had an organ, that was at one time, that might have been a Wurlitzer organ. If you actually go to the San Diego Symphony Hall, which is the former Fox Theater, it has its own organ. It's not a Wurlitzer. It's actually a more conventional pipe organ, but it's a magnificent instrument. And sometimes the San Diego Symphony will put on a program where they will have a silent movie and they'll have a organ accompaniment. And in those days, the organist would have a complete set of instructions for how to play for this particular movie. In other words, the music would be arranged. So the organist might play a little tune by Beethoven, or they might play a nursery rhyme. Whatever they would play, they had indications, this is what you need to do next. And so it's very interesting, but between 1895 and the late 1920s, there was an enormous amount of music that was composed for live performance in cinema to make sure that movies would be a success. Now, I'm showing you this picture here of a mighty Wurlitzer, and what we're looking at here is just the console. The console, or it's the, you can see that there are several keyboards, and so the organist would play with their hands and their feet, and this instrument was a really fun instrument for those who knew how to play it. Now, I'm going to tell you a story here. When I was a boy in Ireland and I was learning piano and organ, my music teacher was someone who used to play one of these organs on the weekend at the movies and be compensated for his activity. Now, he was playing in a cinema or theater. In Ireland, they called them picture houses. And so he was playing at one of these picture houses in the town of Limerick, and the organ had a console that was raised up maybe 15 feet or 20 feet into the air before the movie would start. And the organist was to entertain the crowd while they were waiting for the movie to start. And so that way they'd fill up the cinema and the organist would play, and then at a certain point, the film would start. And sometimes it was a film where the organist would accompany the film, and sometimes it was a talkie. So anyway, my teacher told me the story about one of his colleagues who was playing the Wurlitzer. He was on the console, And he was raised up to entertain the audience for the length of time before they started the movie. So he went up in the air, and then the movie was ready to start. So he hit the button to take the console of the organ back down to earth. He hit the button and nothing happened. He hit the button again, nothing happened. Well, it wasn't a split second before every little kid in that audience knew that the organist was stuck. So what happened next was apple cores, bits of paper, bottles, everything was flying through the air as the audience took it out on the poor organist and until he was relieved and the console came back down. And that was his little adventure. But my music teacher told me that, and I thought, well, I'm not going to play in that cinema. So anyway, I'd also mention another experience which reminds me of why this talk is an important talk for me to think about and to give, and that is on one occasion when Suzanne had her international film series, we had an Italian film that was presented by Professor Pasquale Verdicchio. And the film was about two brothers, one of whom was a politician and the other was his identical twin. In the course of the film, there was an identity crisis, or there was one person standing in for the other, but there was a family feud going on. And the music that was used in this film came from one of the operas by the great conductor Giuseppe Verdi. And it's an opera called I Vespri Siciliani. And so at the end of the movie, the theme, or one of the themes, one of the most powerful, resonant themes from the opera was played as the film was ending, or had ended, and now they were just going through the credits. And so I was listening to this music, the music from the Sicilian Vespers. I was familiar with the music, having heard it on many recordings many, many times. But at that moment, standing there and hearing the music after this film, which was the drama of a struggle between two brothers, I felt that the music of Verdi was more powerful than I had ever experienced it before. And I realized what was happening to me is what happens to you when you go to a film and enjoy the film. And when the film is over, you don't really want to leave. You want to stay with the film. You want to stay with the mood that the film has created. You want to stay in the atmosphere of the movie. You don't really want to leave. And that's why I think that when the film has ended and the credits are rolling, and we keep on looking at those credits, even though there's nothing terribly interesting to read in them, but we're really trying to stay with the atmosphere of the movie. That's the magic of the movie. Okay, next slide. So what is cinema? Well, I'd like to argue that perhaps cinema is the most important cultural development of the 20th century. Of course, as I said earlier, it goes back to 1895, but that's close. So the cinema is an art form that brings together optical, photochemical, although that's in the past, mechanical, digital electronics, business, of course business, music, poetry, and art. Everything comes together. I would argue that the artistic giants of the 20th century are the people who made movies. And I'm thinking now of people like Stanley Kubrick, Milos Forman, These are people who, when you read about them, you realize they lived life on a very large scale. Making a movie was a colossal adventure, sometimes costing hundreds of millions of dollars. Somebody had to be able to convince a lot of people to put up the money that it takes to make even the most simple film. And so if we look at 20th century art, we have to put the film in a special place of recognition. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now the importance of the film, I just trotted out a personal opinion, but now I'd like to underscore that with the opinion of one of the most distinguished musical composers of the 20th century, Ernst Krenek. And so Ernst Krenek was having a conversation with another composer, Will Ogden, who is known to many at UCSD. And Will Ogden knew that Ernst Krenek enjoyed the movies very much. And so he said to Ernst Krenek, okay, Ernst, why did you never write a film score? And the response was, I've never been asked to, and maybe that was a good thing, given the way they've treated the music. A lot could be said about that. But then Krenek went on to say, but I feel that the film has become more the medium for dealing seriously with the problem of our times, that film has become the most important medium for dealing with the problems of our time. And I think that that is a great truth, a great artistic truth in my view. So let's assemble some of the evidence for Krenek's argument. Okay, next picture. And so here's a picture of Stanley Kubrick, one of the most important film directors to talk about in the context of music. It's hard to imagine any director of film whose knowledge of music was not only great and comprehensive, but really, really acute. Back in 1975, a film was released, Barry Lyndon is the name of Kubrick's film. And Barry Lyndon was, for me, perhaps the most beautiful movie I had seen to date. Now, it didn't hurt that the film was made in both Ireland and England and showed extraordinary pastoral beauty. In fact, Kubrick fell in love with making the film, so much so he just didn't want the production of the film to end. He just kept going. And he and his entourage went to different places in England and Ireland. But the unique film that he made was possible in part because Kubrick had heard about a most unusual film projector with an extraordinary set of lenses. This film projector had been built by NASA, and back in 1975, to spend $100,000 on a film projector, that was a lot of money. Fortunately, it was money coming from the government. But after NASA had finished with the projector, it was for sale, and Kubrick bought it. I don't know how he got the word, but he bought that camera. And the camera was so acute in terms of its ability to register every detail that the entire film of Barry Lyndon was made under natural light. There was no lighting system. Many of the scenes took place illuminated only by candles. And if for this alone, I would say it's one of the most beautiful films. Now, one of the interesting details is that Stanley Kubrick thought a great deal about the music he would use in each of his films. He was very unusual. Many people pay for or arrange or create music for a specific film. But Kubrick preferred to use music that had already been performed, and he knew the music inside out. So what Kubrick did in the filming of Barry Lyndon was to basically use music at times when nothing in the script would work, when words were not sufficient. So let me back off for a moment and say, perhaps the most famous use of music in film was in the film 2001, the Kubrick film, in which he used a piece of music by the German composer Richard Strauss. The piece of music was Also sprach Zarathustra. And if you remember the film, The Space Odyssey 2001, if you remember that film, it starts out with this crashing orchestral music, and then it settles on a long sustained note played on the pipe organ. It's unforgettable. And in fact, it's been said by film connoisseurs that if Kubrick had not used that piece of music, the whole film wouldn't have held together as successfully as it did. But this was an example of Kubrick's mastery of a musical form. Now, in the film Barry Lyndon, he uses music by different classical composers, many different classical composers. But there is a dominant motif in the film, and it is a piece of music from Handel, from the great composer George Frederick Handel. And this music is used in the duel scene. There's a very famous duel scene in the movie. And so this piece is used, and the piece has a very dramatic rhythm. The piece is actually, there's a genre of music composed by Bach, but by many, many others, that goes under the name Passacaglia. There's also a type of music called sarabande. And then there's a type of music called chaconne. So what do these things have in common? Well, the chaconne, in Italian chaconne, was brought to Europe from South America in the 17th century. So it's interesting to think that there are cultural connections between Europe of the 18th century and the creativity of native people in Central and South American countries who contributed this extraordinarily dramatic dance. Now in South America, it might have moved quickly, as dancing usually does. But in Europe, where you had aristocrats and you had opera goers and so forth, the music was slowed down. So Handel uses this theme several times in different operas. It's always immensely dramatic. And Kubrick picks up on the detail and he uses it in the duel. Now, what Kubrick did was, I think, a piece of narrative genius, because the duel is not like any other duel. The duel is partly a screw-up. In the first place, you have the duel between two men who deeply hate each other. One of them is Barry Lyndon, but he has been in charge of his wife's son from a previous marriage, and he and the boy do not get along. And so at a certain point, there's a duel. And in the duel, first, Lord Bullingdon fires a shot at Barry Lyndon and misses. And at that point, Barry is willing to end the whole thing, and he fires his shot into the ground rather than to hurt the young man. But the young man hates Barry so much that he insists on his privilege of shooting one more shot. And with that, he takes off Barry Lyndon's leg. This is all played out with immense drama, but the drama is provided largely by the music. Another very powerful example in that same film, Barry Lyndon, is in the scene where the character of Barry, who is played by Ryan O'Neill, falls in love and is accepted by Lady Lyndon, who's played by the actress Marissa Berenson, one of the most beautiful women of her time. Melissa Berenson, granddaughter of the great art collector Bernard Berenson. Anyway, these two fall in love during a card game in a big chateau where a lot of people are gambling and playing cards and so forth. And so these two are looking at each other and they're falling for each other. And Kubrick has only 2 lines of dialogue in an episode that goes on for 4.5 minutes. In that episode of 4.5 minutes, the whole drama is carried by the music, and the music is Franz Schubert. It's his piano trio in E flat. The slow movement of the piano trio is used by Kubrick to show these two young people falling for each other and then going out onto the balcony where they embrace. Everything is done by Schubert. There's no language. There's nothing other than the couple slowly getting closer to each other and embracing. Everything is done by Schubert. The Schubert piece is one of the loveliest pieces of chamber music ever written. I'm sure Schubert would have been thrilled if he'd seen how Kubrick used his music. But Kubrick uses that music with no modification. And so the whole film of Barry Lyndon is 184 minutes long. And this happens exactly halfway through the film. So I would say this is one of the most beautiful films that I think has ever been made. And I would recommend everybody to see that movie again. Okay, next picture. Now, having talked about the use of pre-existing classical music in movies, it was obvious that at some point, the movie maker was going to have music that matched the narrative and not the other way around. So Hollywood was very lucky that there was a whole wave of emigration from Europe in the late 1920s, all through the 30s, up till World War II. And many of the people who were emigrating to the United States were gifted musicians, and a handful of them were already experienced and successful composers. And so one of the most famous of these composers, and one of the most productive in Hollywood, was Max Steiner. Now, Max Steiner was born in Austria into a privileged family. There were a lot of musicians in his family. He won the Emperor's Prize for composition and performance when he was a young musician. And he became perhaps the best known composer in Hollywood. And so here you're seeing a picture of him. Notice the cigar in his left hand. He's sitting at his piano and he's puffing on his cigar and he's modifying a piece of music. Now, let's consider Max Steiner produced something like 150 music scores. One of the most famous scores that was produced by him was Gone with the Wind. The music for Gone with the Wind was produced in 2 weeks of absolutely frantic composition, in which Max Steiner did what a lot of other people in Hollywood, they went to a doctor who prescribed Benzedrine. And so Gone with the Wind, that music was written on Benzedrine. And Max Steiner also wrote the music for Casablanca. And in that film, there's an iconic theme. And again, credit for that goes to Max Steiner. Next picture. Okay, this is where Steiner was born, in Vienna. And he was known to all the musical circles. He was a composer of opera and a composer of instrumental music. He was a very, very accomplished musician by the time he came to Hollywood. But in Hollywood, he had to provide what the directors and producers were looking for. And he worked with people like David Selznick, who was very famous as a producer, focusing particularly on scores and screenplays, but also a control freak and difficult to work with. Max Steiner, who's one of the few Hollywood composers for whom a full-length biography has been written. It was published quite recently. And so Max Steiner made a tremendous name for himself. Let's have the next picture, the next slide, if you will. Okay, so the first film that Steiner produced the music for was called The Symphony of 6 Million. And that was very successful. And so based on that success, he was asked to do the music for King Kong. Now, in the film King Kong, there's a 3-note motif, which is kind of the monster motif. It's very like in the music of Wagner. He would use what he called leitmotifs or leading motifs. He would use a piece of music to tell you, this is the sword, or this is Mother Earth, or this is the ring. All of these images were created in musical form and manipulated by Wagner to prepare you for the dramatic action that was going to happen. Max Steiner followed something like that. So King Kong, the menace of the monster is conveyed by a 3-note Wagnerian motif. But then, if you listen to the rest of the music of King Kong, and I have been listening to versions on CD, but King Kong contains some of the most tender, poetic, beautiful music, absolutely beautiful music. But if you watch it in the film, you'll get what was selected for the film. But happily, it's possible to get CDs with all of the music, which you can play in your own CD performer, in your own stereo system, and so forth. And so I've been enjoying listening to the score of King Kong recently. Okay, next picture. Okay, and so the biography of Max Steiner was written by Stephen C. Smith, published earlier this year, just a couple of months ago. And so one of the things that I should mention is a guy like Max Steiner, who was very powerful, very prestigious, but he couldn't always count on the people who were promoting the film or making the film to overuse a theme. Like any good composer, he wanted to have just the perfect balance between the creative work that he produced. But sometimes he saw his theme. So the theme of Tara is a little bit overused. The same thing, it's almost rhymes, but later, David Lean's film, Dr. Zhivago, the composer wrote a very pretty theme, but the movie people overused it. The composer wanted the theme to fit the moment between Dr. Zhivago and Lara. That was supposed to happen, but the whole thing got kind of distorted by overusing the theme and then using the theme in promotional materials. So after a while, many of us just got sick of hearing the theme. And that's a danger with film music. Another issue about film music. The best. Sorry?
Today.
Is that a question? Sorry? Is that a question? Okay. So let me go back and just say, yeah. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So now, at the beginning of this talk, I said to you that movie making has elements of Italian light opera, particularly 18th century commedia dell'arte plays. So the interesting thing is that opera, as we understand it, was an Italian invention. It started almost exactly at the year 1600. And at first, opera was performed largely in the palaces of great Italian aristocrats. But as time went on, the public wanted more entertaining opera than a reenactment of a Greek tragedy or some type of story which was called opera seria, serious opera about big, heavy, weighty themes. So Italians, of course, wanted something lighter. And so there appeared in the 18th century a couple of extraordinary playwrights. One was a Venetian nobleman who didn't have any money called Carlo Gozzi, and the other was named Goldoni. Carlo Goldoni. So these two gentlemen started writing a different kind of play. And that play usually presents a boy meeting a girl, and then in the second act, it falls apart, and there's great lamentation and sadness and frustration, and perhaps bad guys interfering with the boy and the girl. And then in the third act, the boy and girl are back together and everyone's very happy. Well, this type of entertainment was created by people like Gozzi and Goldoni, and they were very sophisticated theater people. And one of the great influences of Carlo Gozzi was Mozart. Mozart was surely, if we take the top three great composers of opera, you could put in Wagner, you put in Verdi, but the other one would have to be Mozart. And the thing about Mozart that makes him so extraordinary is that Mozart was something of a dramaturge. He was somebody who really loved everything to do with the theater. He was interested in how it all worked. And Mozart's music has an extraordinary sophistication in terms of drama that's happening with the singers, the actors, and the orchestra and the music. Everything with Mozart is based on that. Well, Mozart was very influenced by Carlo Gozzi. And now I have the next slide. This is Carlo Goldoni, again, influenced Mozart. Now it's interesting that Carlo Gozzi and Carlo Goldoni didn't like each other. They really hated each other. And Goldoni eventually left Italy. But it didn't matter to Mozart as far as he was concerned. He was getting great ideas. So now how does this all relate to film? Well, when people started making movies, the public was looking for entertainment. And what better entertainment than a delightful comedy or a charming film about boy meets girl, and in the second reel, boy loses girl, and then in the third reel, to make everyone happy, the boy and the girl are reunited again. That was a Hollywood formula that came right out of 18th century Italian opera. And so maybe have the next picture. Okay, so what I'm arguing here is the roots of film music are pantomime, show booth out in the street, vaudeville comedy, puppetry. And then, of course, that movement called Commedia dell'arte. And so to make these stories work, the audience has to suspend disbelief. Now, this brings me right back to Mozart. If you take the film, well, I said the film, but if you take the opera for which a magnificent film has been created, Don Giovanni, a key moment in the opera, Don Giovanni, who's off to do a nefarious deed, exchanges his costume with his servant, Leporello. So now, Don Giovanni is going around looking like Leporello, and Leporello is going around looking like Don Giovanni. Well, any audience with any intelligence will see that this is just a contrivance. But once you suspend disbelief and decide you want to enjoy the entertainment, then you're perfectly happy to accept the mask and the deception, even if it's not a very effective deception. And so this brings me to another film that I would like to recommend, if you haven't already seen it or seen it several times. The film Don Giovanni by Joseph Losey, who I think was one of the great American film directors. Joseph Losey very sadly, during the McCarthy era, when America annihilated so much of its talent. Joseph Losey was one of the people who was basically driven out of the country during the McCarthy era, went to Europe and continued to make extraordinary films. And for me, the film Don Giovanni has to be one of the most beautiful and perfect films that I've ever seen. Also, going back to the suspension of disbelief, another Mozart opera, The Magic Flute, was made into a beautiful film by the great Swedish filmmaker Bergman. And so Bergman actually used a theater that was 200 years old in Drottningholm in Sweden. And he was able to use in that film all the stage machinery and costumes and other things that had been accumulated in this great center of theater. In the making of The Magic Flute, if you listen to the overture, and just before the action in the film starts, you see a 12-year-old girl sitting in the front row, watching with excitement. And that kid is the director's daughter. And he introduces her to the story at the very same age that he was, 12 years old, when he first heard Mozart's opera. And of course, he wanted all his life to make a film from this. Now, obviously, we have film that is driven by an already existing piece, but mostly film music has to be created. It has to be composed for the moment. And so there's an interesting story here. If you look at some of the composers, one particularly well-known composer is John Barry. If you remember the film Out of Africa, the music for that was written by John Barry. But if you remember all of the dozen or so James Bond films, the James Bond music was written by John Barry. So there's an amusing story that John Barry was sharing a hotel room with Michael Caine, the actor. And Michael Caine, somebody said, "How did you sleep last night?" And he said, he said, "Oh, I couldn't get a wink of sleep. This bloody fellow was banging at the piano all night." What was happening was John Barry was composing under extreme pressure, and the music that he composed was the music for the first James Bond film. And so that classic James Bond theme came out of that. The first person to hear it was Michael Caine. And of course, the person who created it was John Barry. So may I have the next slide, if you please? Oh, yeah. Now I'd like to come to one of the most famous of all the composers of music for film, and that is Bernard Herrmann. Now, one of the most famous films made by Alfred Hitchcock was the film Psycho. And if you look here at the information from the cover of the DVD, you'll see the names of the actors, the director, but you don't see who wrote the music, even though the most scorching episode in the film Psycho is the shower scene. And what makes that episode so terrifying is the music that Bernard Herrmann wrote. Now, let me just briefly recap the story. This is a story of a couple who badly want to get married, and she steals money and then is on the run, and she stays overnight in this very spooky hotel, and during the night somebody comes to attack her, and there's this terrifying scene in the shower. Now, it turns out that Hitchcock wrote the movie, prepared everything, but when he asked Bernard Herrmann to compose the music, he said he didn't need any music for the shower scene, that the shower scene should not have any music. Well, Bernard Herrmann heard this instruction and he thought to himself, well, I'm not going to do that. And so when he composed the film, when Bernard Herrmann composed the music for the film, he actually wrote a scene for the shower moment. And in that, he does something very unusual. String instruments in film usually produce a beautiful sound, a really lovely sound. But that's not what Bernard Herrmann wants. He wants a very dry, harsh, scraping sound. And Hitchcock, after seeing the whole movie come together and hearing the music, Hitchcock said to Bernard Herrmann, you need to compose something for the shower scene. It really needs music. And Herrmann said, I've already got it. And so the music then was performed in the shower scene, in which Janet Leigh makes, her life is ended. So now that was part of a genre of music and a genre of films that dwelt on psychological themes. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is Bernard Herrmann. Bernard Herrmann wrote for all of the films. He didn't write all of the music, but he wrote for all the films of Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock was a great director with a fabulous sense of timing. And he was very interested in probing psychological disturbance. Remember, this was a time when America was really gripped by the ideas of Sigmund Freud, and psychoanalysis was all over the country. And so this genre of film and the kind of music that Bernard Herrmann wrote, which was very edgy, very dark music, was just perfect for Hitchcock. Bernard Herrmann, eventually, he and Hitchcock had a disagreement about something. And so the very last film that Bernard Herrmann worked on and wrote the music for was Taxi Driver. So Taxi Driver was a Martin Scorsese film, and it has a dark, jazzy type of music, and that is his last piece. Very good. Have the next slide. So Bernard Herrmann, one of the things he said about his collaboration with Hitchcock, he said, he made 60% of the movie, but I completed it for him. That's a very good statement because he's right. Bernard Herrmann really made those movies because his orchestral scoring was so masterful. I think that when you acknowledge the power of music, that comment that he made 60% of the movie, but I completed it for him, I think that comment has a lot of truth. Now, just to go back for a moment, when music was introduced into film, there was a lot of discussion about why you had to have music. And one argument was that you had to have music because the projector made so much noise that it annoyed the public and they needed to hear something over the projector. I personally, I'm not persuaded by that argument. I remember seeing a lot of films when I was a youngster where the projector was there in the room, and the biggest problem we would usually have is the projector breaking down or the film breaking, probably because when we watched film in Ireland, so much had been cut out of the film that the copy was held together with Scotch tape and so forth. But this brings me to, well, let me go to the next, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here's another one of these psychological films, a Hitchcock film. And what's interesting, this one, the music was written by Franz Waxman. Now, Franz Waxman, our colleague Steve Baird, his delightful wife, Carol, is a niece of Franz Waxman. And so she grew up in Hollywood, and she was around all those people composing music and so forth. So one of the psychological thrillers was the book Rebecca. Rebecca was written by Daphne du Maurier. And in this still from the movie, you see it's Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine. Laurence Olivier is playing the part of a man called Maxim de Winter. He meets and marries this lovely young girl and takes her home to this huge estate called Manderley. But then she finds that the estate is haunted, as it were, by the memory of the previous Mrs. de Winter. And there's a very hostile governess, Mrs. Danvers, who's there and makes the young lady uncomfortable. Now, the interesting thing is, here's a film that's named Rebecca, but you don't ever meet Rebecca in the film. Rebecca's character is completely suggestion, story, psychological manipulation. And the music is beautiful. Franz Waxman was a very, very gifted composer. And one of the things Franz Waxman did as a composer was to reintroduce some of those 18th century forms, Passacaglia and fugue. Well, of course, fugue goes back earlier than the 18th century. But anyway, that is something about Franz Waxman. Okay, next slide. And there's Alfred Hitchcock, a very, very dominant personality. His father and the family owned a grocery store somewhere in London. He grew up there, and he evolved into becoming a great international film director and sponsored many, many careers. Okay, next. Now we come to one of the most fascinating characters of all, Leopold Stokowski. Now, Stokowski was, again, a Londoner. One parent had Polish ancestry and had the name Stokes. That was his father. His mother was Irish. And when he grew up, he had a great fascination with music. He was very, very talented, became an organist, and went on from being an organist to being one of the greatest conductors of his time. And so he was also a great promoter of his own image. And so the name Stokowski is his invention. His real name was Stokes. It didn't matter. As Stokowski, he was a huge personality. Now, Stokowski was someone who was influenced by great musical contemporaries such as um, Albert Schweitzer and Pablo Casals. And so Albert Schweitzer was an organist and musician who had a very strong vocation to help sick people in Africa. That was a time when France and Belgium had many colonies in Africa, and there was a lot of illness and disease. So Schweitzer gave up a life in music to be a doctor in the Belgian Congo. But before he did that, Schweitzer had become deeply acquainted with the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. And Schweitzer was the person who, in a way, reintroduced Bach to the world in the 20th century, because Schweitzer realized that the key to understanding Bach's music was to read the words. Read the words of the cantatas, read everything that was in Bach's Bible, because Bach, in writing his music, he matched the mood of the religious text. And he did it with such great passion that even though Bach never wrote an opera, his great church music has all the force of really great, serious, dramatic opera. Well, Stokowski realized this, and he started adapting pieces of organ music by Bach, translating them for the orchestra. And Stokowski was such a very fine musician that he was made the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And so he spent close to 30 years, during which he built the Philadelphia Orchestra into the finest orchestra in the country at that time. And just to give you an example, he had as the first cellist a man called Bernard Rose. Rose was such a great cellist that he trained about 15 other cellists, and they were known as the Rose section of the orchestra. In any event, Stokowski was a very restless individual. He was a rather unusual character. He walked around on the roofs of buildings, often nude, and if people thought it was odd, he didn't care. He had a lot of extramarital affairs. He was a character. Now, in Stokowski's life, he came out to the West Coast, and Hollywood found Stokowski very, very interesting. Have the next slide, if you please. The next slide, in which, well, what I'm going to show you is a picture of Walt Disney. Now, Walt Disney had a tremendous interest in music, and Walt Disney was utterly fascinated by a musician like Stokowski. They were introduced on one occasion, but they didn't really get a chance to talk. And then one night, Walt Disney was in his favorite hotel in Los Angeles, or favorite restaurant, Chasen's, and he looks over and he sees that Stokowski is sitting at a table all by himself. And so Disney goes over and reintroduces himself. And now the two of them become deeply interested in a collaboration. And it was during that dinner that the idea for the movie Fantasia came about. This was a joint conception of Walt Disney and Leopold Stokowski. And Disney had a very, very sophisticated interest in music, but Disney had something else. And that is that when you write cartoon music, the music is absolutely wedded to the action. The music now, the cartoon character is basically acting out the music. And the suspension of disbelief comes into operation, because remember, you have cartoons like Wile E. Coyote, Roadrunner, and so forth. What's really happening is you see the cartoon character taking an awful beating, but in the next frame, they've jumped back to life and so forth. So this is just like Commedia dell'arte, and it's something that calls for really, really well-written music. Okay, next. Oh, and this picture, if I could go back to the last picture, what Stokowski started then became a tradition with conductors. So here you see James Levine, former conductor of the New York Metropolitan Opera and conductor of the New York Symphony. And so here he is with Mickey Mouse, who originally was called Mortimer Mouse, but Walt Disney's sister-in-law said, no, you can't use a name like Mortimer. You have to get a name that kids will like. And so the mouse became Mickey Mouse. Okay, next picture. And so here are Walt Disney and Stokowski together. Now, Stokowski had been a pioneer in recording music. Stokowski actually paid huge attention to the dynamics of recording music. And he had systems and instructions and details. He was a really masterful producer. Walt Disney was very, very comfortable because he and Stokowski seemed to be at an intuitive level working very, very well together. Now, there were other people writing music. For example, a composer called Scott Bradley. Scott Bradley had a very fine career as a composer, musician. He was a very sophisticated musician. Then he decided he wanted to write cartoon music. And the attraction of writing cartoon music was that the music always matched the action. In a cartoon, every detail is matched to the music and the action. Okay, next picture. And here we see animation, which developed. This is Stokowski shaking hands with Mickey Mouse. And I should mention that Stokowski, one of the greatest conductors of his day, said, music is really written for children. The best audiences are children. And Stokowski in Philadelphia made sure that he was always entertaining children. And even on one occasion, he totally delighted the children because when they were going to perform a piece by the composer Saint-Saëns, The Carnival of the Animals, he brought real elephants onto the stage. And of course, the kids went nuts. They loved this sort of thing. Stokowski was just like a big kid at heart, but hugely sophisticated musician and a great facilitator of events. Okay, next picture. Now, I've talked for over an hour and I haven't said anything about documentaries. So documentaries don't necessarily require music, but sometimes every film requires music. And so I would just like, in passing, to mention about documentaries. One of the most famous musical documentaries ever made was a series involving the pianist Glenn Gould. Glenn Gould was a Canadian-born pianist who remained a Canadian citizen, who was the great Bach player of his time, particularly piano. Now, the 20th century brought Bach back into music in a hugely important way. Musicians like Leopold Stokowski, Glenn Gould, and Pablo Casals, the great cellist, all of these people basically reintroduced Bach to classical music, so that today Bach's reputation is far greater than it was in his own time when he was respected as a great organist and very knowledgeable about the design of organs and so forth. Bach's sons, Bach had 22 children, and a number of them became very famous and distinguished composers. His sons respected him, but they didn't really see him as the colossal figure. I mean, Bach to music is kind of like Shakespeare or Homer to literature. Bach is absolutely colossal. So the very eccentric Glenn Gould made a very interesting set of documentary films, 32 short films about Glenn Gould. Next picture. And here's Pablo Casals. When I look at this picture and see the pipe in his mouth, I'm reminded of the Magritte painting of a pipe that says, this is not a pipe. And Casals, as a young man, was very poor. He couldn't afford a cello. He was using two pieces of wood and he was scraping one against the other. He was so desperate to become a cello player. Eventually, enough money was accumulated. He bought his first cello. And then he used to haunt the music stores. And excuse me, I have to shut my front door. My apologies. One of the bugbears of Zoom is having leaf blowers in your neighborhood, making their discordant noise. So anyway, what I wanted to say here is that Pablo Casals, he, as a young man without very much money, he haunted the music stores. One day, he saw a collection of music for solo cello that had been written by Bach. He didn't know what this was, but he eventually saved up enough money to buy the score, take it home, and then Pablo Casals essentially relaunched that music. And he brought it back into public view so that today, wonderful cellists like Yo-Yo Ma perform this music to the delight of audiences everywhere. And so this was one of those situations where music and film all come together. Next picture. Okay, well, I talked about Barry Lyndon earlier, and I just wanted to mention that Bach and Handel, Paisiello, Mozart, Vivaldi, Schubert, all of these came together to provide the music for his great film. Next slide. Okay, this one I already talked about, so let's move on to the next slide. Now I just want to mention, sometimes in a film, you will have a story about a composer and you'll have a really great performer and you end up with a really wonderful film that's a permanent record. And so in 1945, a film was made called A Song to Remember. It was a sort of biopic of Chopin. And the pianist who played the part of, or the one who played Chopin's music was a Spanish pianist called Jose Iturbi. The remarkable thing about Jose Iturbi's contribution is that when the film was released, everyone ran to the record shops and all the Chopin records were bought up and you couldn't find a Chopin record in Los Angeles for weeks until more supply came in. It was all because Jose Iturbi played so magnificently and won people over to the story of Chopin. So this is a film that is really worth watching, A Song to Remember with Jose Iturbi. Okay, next picture. And Another film that was made, oh yeah, this is A Song to Remember. This is the Chopin film. But notice that in the credits, although there are not very many, Jose Iturbi is not mentioned. And although everybody loved the film, some people then dismissed Jose Iturbi as not a serious Chopin performer because he performed in Hollywood. Well, he was one of the great pianists of his time. He was a magnificent musician, and he deserves his place in the history of music. Next picture. And then in 1947, after success of the Iturbi film, the next film was about Clara and Robert Schumann. And in this film, Katharine Hepburn plays the part of Schumann's wife. Schumann, one of the most brilliant classical composers, as well as a great writer, a music critic, a sponsor of other people's careers. Schumann, unfortunately, was bipolar. And once you understand that he really had a severe mental illness, you can re-listen to his music, as I'm doing, and hearing things that are better explained. I don't know if any of you have seen the film by a colleague from New York who has made a presentation, I think at UCSD a couple of years ago, in which he recreated the story of Schumann from letters written between Clara and Robert. And at the same time, he performed the music and explained why some of these pieces sounded the way they do, which is a very, very agitated type of music, but also incredibly beautiful music. In the film, A Song of Love, which you can pull up on YouTube, you see Katharine Hepburn doing a great job of simulating playing the piano. And in the background, one of the 7 children that Clara and Robert had together is yelling for its milk. And so you see all this drama. And also the film introduces the character of the young Johannes Brahms, who came to live in the Schumann house, fell in love with Clara, but even after her husband died, she basically said, look, I'm not having any more children, and I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to performing my husband's music everywhere. And that's exactly what Clara Schumann did. She took her husband's music around the world, and that was an extraordinary tribute to him and an act of love. Next picture. Okay. Now, film also evoked the creation of new types of musical instrument. So remember, some of the movies that you've seen over time include very spooky music, sometimes with sort of eerie woo sounds that come in and out of pitch. And so there were 2 musical instruments that were developed during the 20th century, which were used heavily in filmmaking. One was called the onde Martineau, after the French word wave, because the music is kind of wavy. And then the other one is the theremin. And the theremin is named after a Russian musician and inventor, Leon Theremin. And this was used in psychodramas to create very spooky music. Next picture. And American movies were very much reliant on great classical music from the 19th century, music by Brahms, Mahler, Beethoven, Richard Strauss, Richard Wagner. So they used that, and that was fine. But other composers came along, like Henry Mancini, and he wrote tunes like Moon River. And one of the things that was found out was that in Hollywood, if you wrote music for a film, and then if you wrote a really good tune, then the next thing is the public wanted to hear the recording of the song. And so that actually started the whole idea of having a record release or a CD going with each film. And so Henry Mancini, he wrote that very nice song for the movie in which Audrey Hepburn starred. Okay, next picture. Now, one of the most famous of all the 20th century composers of music for film was Ennio Morricone, who died only a couple of months ago. He was born in 1928, and so he lived into his early 90s. He wrote 500 musical scores, and he said something very, very important on this slide. Most people experience music as in film as a subconscious suggestion. Music manages to show things that are not visible. Music manages to work against the dialogue, or music will help to tell a story that the images do not reveal. He put that very, very well. And those of you who've seen the beautiful film, Cinema Paradiso, that was a collaboration between Ennio Morricone and his son. And remember, in Cinema Paradiso, a successful film director comes back to the little Italian village where he grew up, and he's coming for the funeral of someone who made his childhood a very happy experience, and that was the projectionist at the local cinema. And with this wonderful projectionist, his friend, the composer and filmmaker gradually becomes a connoisseur of film and a successful individual. Now, Ennio Morricone, if you listen to NPR during the afternoon, at some point they have a financial report, and some days when the market is down, they play a piece of music from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly by Ennio Morricone. And this is an example of a musical genius because he uses things like a whip crack, a hand slap, and a strange wah-wah sound on the trumpet to create a musical mood. And he worked with Clint Eastman. Clint Eastman didn't have a whole lot of words, but in the movies, the music certainly made up for the deficit. Okay, next picture. Yeah, a whistle, a hand slap, and a whip crack, and the Mexican trumpet. That was Ennio Morricone. Next picture. Another that I should mention, of course, is Nino Rota, Italian composer who wrote the music for The Godfather. And that beautiful music that's in The Godfather, this is music he was writing as a child and a boy. He was trying to write a symphony. And eventually he had this music that was not completed. And so he used it in the film The Godfather. But you can get a CD with the music of The Godfather, to about a 15 or 20-minute suite of music. It's beautiful music, it's wonderful music, it's sophisticated music. And so I take my hat off to Nino Rota. Next slide. And then John Williams, one of the greatest musicians composing for the screen. And Williams, the power of his musical writing, there's a documentary done for the BBC called The Sound of Film. And the presenter, Neil Brand, talks about how when people had seen the movie Close Encounters back in 1977 and heard the music, after they left the theater, everybody was looking up into the sky. That was the effect that that movie had. And in fact, the film Close Encounters was inspired by a childhood experience where the composer of the music watched a meteor shower with his dad, and that stuck in his mind, and that eventually became Close Encounters of a Third Kind. Okay, next picture. A last thought that I should leave you with is that many classical composers, and the examples I'm going to pick are Ralph Vaughan Williams, and also the composer Dmitri Shostakovich. They wrote for film, as well as composing symphonies, operas, and all the other contributions that they made. Now, each of them, both Vaughan Williams and Benjamin Britten and Dmitri Shostakovich and Prokofiev, they all said that writing music for film made them better composers because they had to condense their ideas and link it to something happening in the film. And they became better composers as a result of this. Okay, Vaughan Williams, one of the films that he contributed to was the film Scott of the Antarctic. And this is about an unsuccessful exploration of the Antarctic, which resulted in the deaths of all the participants. Anyway, the music was written for the film by Vaughan Williams. And at a key moment, when they're confronting a colossal obstacle in the ice, he has a huge orchestral passage with a climax, and in comes the organ, full force. So it's a very, very powerful, film. Next picture. Okay. And this is Shostakovich, who wrote symphonies, very dark often, but he wrote really, really beautiful music. He was an extraordinarily gifted pianist. He wrote an opera called Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District, which is an opera about violence against women and how a woman strikes back and then is condemned. But this opera really annoyed Stalin, and Shostakovich was very lucky to escape with his life. Okay, next picture. And I think that brings me to the end. So I hope I've been able to convey the point that music has an important part to play in film, that music sometimes is a more powerful tool than words or actions in conveying moods for the screen, and also that music from 18th century opera, particularly comic opera, has had an important part in the development and success of the movies. Thank you very much.
Wow, Harry, what an amazing overview. You know, all of you, we talked at one point about possibly having little music snippets throughout the talk, but look at this, without even including that, you have just gone on for an hour and a half with so much amazing information. I want to go back and listen to this recording again. It was terrific. I kept thinking, oh, I want to see that movie again and think about the music. Or, oh, yes, I remember that scene. So anyway, will you be willing to take a few questions?
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Wonderful. So participants that have hung with us, if there are any of you that would like to ask a question, feel free.
Yes. Yes.
Go ahead.
Why didn't you mention Leopold Stokowski's marriage to the heiress Gloria Vanderbilt?
Oh, okay. Because I also failed to mention his marriage to Olga Samarov, the famous pianist, who was she was born Louise Hickenlooper, and
oh my God.
Yeah, she was a very fine musician in her own right. And so I didn't mention Gloria Vanderbilt because actually it didn't occur to me, but thank you for asking. Do you remember, was there a musical connection between Gloria Vanderbilt and Stokowski? What did they see in each other?
she revered him as a stable husband because he was elderly.
Ah,
He had
okay.
not a good life before she met him, and the fact that he was such a famous, revered, composer and personality,
Yeah,
that suited her well, even though I believe he was 30 some odd years older than she was. But today it's not unusual because rich men, whether they have any talent at all, marry trophy wives
yes.
and sometimes have children with them who were born when their grandchildren of a similar age. But men can do whatever they want, as my favorite author, Saul Bellow, did when he had a child willingly with his fourth wife. And a little girl was born. And Saul Bellow passed away before I think she was even 4 years old. But that didn't matter at all, as long as their money can help them live a good life,
Yeah.
which has happened.
Well, let me tell you another story about
Please.
one of Stokowski's wives.
Yes.
It was Olga Samarov, also Louise Hickenlooper. At a dinner in New York, she was sitting next to Gustav Mahler. And Mahler was in a very bad mood, and he wasn't making any conversation. And this remarkable woman, Louise Hickenlooper from Texas, she said to Mahler, "What do you think of Tolstoy or what do you think of Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov? Do you really think blah, blah, blah?" Mahler jumped up from his chair, raced into the next room, which was a library, took out the book and started discussing chapter after chapter, detail after detail. It just turned out that one musician asks another a question about literature, and Gustav Mahler has all the answers.
My goodness. You know, the poor man was married to Alma Mahler.
Yes.
That has a storied background with all Walter Gropius and the other artists that revered her.
Franz
And
Werfel.
yeah, and she lived on the west side of Manhattan, where my family owned real estate and moved to the east side of Manhattan, and is the major benefactor of the Whitney Museum. She died with two of Mahler's daughters, and Mahler had a heart condition, and they had a very, very tumultuous marriage because he was a genius composing and not a favorite of Hitler, and they moved to America, thank goodness, and survived. But the poor man, the genius composer, Mahler, Gustav Mahler, died at 51, which is so sad. So sad.
Yes, that was one of the greatest.
Their private lives are sometimes more interesting than anything else that survives them beside their music.
Well,
and my son, who played, my oldest son, the genius, played the cello, and he would finish before the orchestra in his school finished. And I say, why did you finish before anybody else? You're supposed to finish with the other people. He said, no, I really enjoy the feel of the strings on my fingers. That's what my son, who became an electrical engineer and worked with chips to invent small machines and inventions in his career. Anyhow, he has magic fingers, and his mother, me, does glass sculpture. And I guess I gave him the magic fingers. And
Could we see if anyone else has a question?
Marianne has a question. Okay.
Yes.
Unmute yourself.
Is that okay?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
What do you consider the most successful soundtrack, and what do you consider the least in the scene?
Oh,
that's hard. Sorry.
It's a terrific question. The most successful soundtrack. You know, I'm going to make a suggestion. I just watched the other day for the first time the Cat Concerto. The Cat Concerto was Scott Bradley, this magnificent cartoonist, composer, also a serious composer. I just watched a couple of days ago the Cat Concerto, which is a performance of Liszt's Second Hungarian Rhapsody.
Oh,
And you have
terrific.
Tom and Jerry. You have the cat and the mouse, Tom and Jerry. The whole thing is so brilliantly put together. The music and the action, they fit each other so well that I know it's kind of a joke when I say it, but that's what I would. The other thing I'm going to say is one of the films that I really, really loved when I was young, and it had a big influence on my music listening, but there was a film called The Golden Ring, which is a documentary about the making of the recording of Wagner's Ring by George Schulte. Yeah, it is now it's, when you go back to watch it, it's a bit dated, but that film cast a spell over me that never really went away. Another one.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk and presentation.
It's lovely to meet you again.
Song on the Wings of Song.
Okay, very good. All right, yeah. Well, are there any other questions? And you know, I do promise sometime in the future to do a talk on Mahler.
Good.
So we'll have something about Mahler and the extraordinary wife. And of course, he could have married a much more suitable wife. Natalie Bauer-Lechner. She was a musician. She understood him psychologically. She was a terrific amanuensis. And it was a great tragedy that he ignored her and instead went for Alma, who was nothing but trouble.
All right, well, seeing no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the meeting with my sincere thanks. This was an absolutely fabulous presentation. I loved every moment of it. Thank you so very much, Harry.
You're very, very welcome. You're all welcome. And thank you all very much for listening. Okay.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks so much.
You too. You too, Marianne.